The house came to me on a quiet, unremarkable day. I'd been living a pretty typical life. Long hours at work, barely any time to myself, and weekends spent doing nothing more exciting than running errands or collapsing on the couch. So, when the letter arrived, thick parchment folded into a wax-sealed envelope, it felt oddly out of place. At first, I thought it was some kind of scam. The handwriting was formal, the kind you'd see in old documents or historical archives, and the language it used was stiff and overly proper. It informed me, quite plainly, that I was the new owner of an ancestral property, passed down to me as the last surviving descendant. There was no mention of who had owned it previously or why I hadn't heard of it before. The letter included a set of heavy, rusted keys and an address scribbled hastily at the bottom, as if it were an afterthought. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, who even uses paper letters anymore? It felt too strange to be real. That weekend, I decided to check it out. The house wasn't far from the city, a few hours' drive into a more rural, wooded area. As I got closer, the roads turned narrower, winding between dense trees that seemed to close in around me. There was something calming about it at first, like I was escaping the stress of my regular life. But the closer I got to the house, the more uneasy I began to feel. The property was surrounded by a tall wrought iron gate, the kind that you see in movies, with spiked tops that seemed more decorative than functional. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the path leading to the house was overgrown with weeds and dead leaves. The house itself was massive, far larger than I'd expected. It was an old Victorian, the kind that looked like it belonged on a postcard or in a ghost story. Ivy climbed up its walls, and several windows were cracked or covered in grime so thick you couldn't see through them. Despite its state of disrepair, the house had a certain grandeur to it, like it had once been important, even if it was now long forgotten. The front door was heavy and warped with age, but after some effort, I managed to shove it open. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of wood rot and dust. My footsteps echoed in the wide entrance hall as I took in the sight of a grand staircase, its banister ornately carved but splintering in places. There were several doors leading off the main hall, each one slightly ajar, hinting at rooms filled with forgotten furniture and layers of dust. I spent most of that first day exploring. It felt like walking through a time capsule, each room offering a glimpse into a past I knew nothing about. The furniture was old but sturdy, covered in sheets that had turned yellow with age. There were bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, their titles faded beyond recognition, and a fireplace in nearly every room, though none looked like they'd been used in decades. The kitchen was the only part of the house that felt somewhat modern. It had appliances that looked like they were from the 80s, a stark contrast to the rest of the house's antique charm. The attic was the last place I decided to check. The pull-down ladder groaned under my weight as I climbed up, my flashlight cutting through the thick layer of dust that hung in the air. The attic was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, most of it covered in thick sheets. It was clear no one had been up there in years, maybe decades. As I moved around, careful not to trip over the uneven floorboards, I spotted something leaning against the far wall. At first, I thought it was just a large mirror, but as I got closer, I realized it was a painting. A family portrait, to be exact. The portrait was enormous, almost too big to have been brought up into the attic in the first place. It depicted a group of people, 8 of them, dressed in clothing that looked like it was from the early 1900s. Their faces were stern, almost emotionless, and their eyes seemed unervingly lifelike, as though they were watching me. But what really caught my attention was the figure in the background. Unlike the others, who were clearly human, This figure was shadowy and indistinct, as if the artist had deliberately obscured its features. Its presence was unnerving, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I carried the portrait downstairs, brushing off years of dust as best as I could. Despite its size, it wasn't as heavy as I'd expected, and for some reason, I felt compelled to put it on display. It was a part of the house, after all, and it seemed wrong to leave it hidden away in the attic. I hung it in the living room, above the fireplace, and stood back to admire it. There was something captivating about it, even if it was unsettling. The first few days in the house were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, making small repairs, and getting accustomed to the creaks and groans of the old building. At night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind outside, or my own paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed something strange about the portrait. As I passed through the living room on my way to the kitchen, I glanced at the painting and froze. The shadowy figure had moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I was certain it wasn't in the same spot as before. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Paintings don't move. It's impossible. But the unease I felt was impossible to ignore. By the fourth night, I was sure something was wrong. The figure had moved again, this time closer to one of the family members in the painting, a young woman with a faint smile. Her expression, I realized with a chill, was no longer the same. Her smile had vanished, replaced with a look of fear. Her eyes seemed darker, almost black, and the longer I stared, the more I thought I could see streaks of what looked like paint dripping down her cheeks. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed up, sitting in the living room with the painting in full view. I watched it for hours, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. When morning came, I told myself I'd imagined it all. The lighting in the room must have changed, or maybe I was just overtired. Still, the unease lingered, and I found myself avoiding the painting whenever possible. That's where things stand for now. The house feels heavier somehow, like it's alive in a way I can't explain. I'm trying to convince myself it's all in my head, but deep down, I know something isn't right. The unease only grew as the days passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just in the living room where the portrait hung, but in every room of the house. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of discomfort, like the air around me was heavier. Then it became more pronounced. I started noticing shadows in my peripheral vision, fleeting and indistinct, but they were there. When I turned to look, there was nothing but empty space. By the fifth night, I was actively avoiding the living room. I didn't want to look at the portrait again. The thought of it made my skin crawl. Instead, I tried to distract myself by cleaning up more of the house. I'd inherited piles of old papers, letters, and photographs that had been stuffed into drawers and boxes. Most of it was mundane: receipts, handwritten notes, grocery lists, but some of the older letters caught my attention. They were written in the same stiff, formal handwriting as the letter that had informed me about the house. They mentioned family names I didn't recognize, along with cryptic references to keeping our legacy intact and honoring the pact. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just old-fashioned language, or maybe it was something more sinister. I tried to brush it off, but the words stuck in my mind. Honoring the pact. What pact? And what legacy were they talking about? That night, curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I needed to confront the source of my unease head-on. So I walked into the living room, turned on every light, and forced myself to look at the portrait. My heart sank. The shadowy figure had moved again, now standing directly behind the young woman whose expression had changed days earlier. But it wasn't just her expression that had changed. Her entire face had warped. Her eyes were completely black, her mouth twisted into a silent scream, and there were streaks of red dripping from her cheeks. It didn't look like paint anymore. It looked wet like fresh blood. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a side table. I spent the next day trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I told myself it was some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the light. I even went so far as to look up local art restoration experts, thinking maybe the portrait had some kind of defect or strange material that was reacting to humidity or temperature changes. But paintings don't change overnight. Figures don't move, and faces don't twist into screams. On the 6th night, I decided to test it. I set up a camera in the living room, pointing directly at the painting. If the figure moved again, I wanted proof. I stayed up late, sitting in the adjacent dining room with the camera's feed pulled up on my laptop. The live footage showed nothing but the still eerie portrait hanging above the fireplace. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I dozed off in the chair. When I woke up, it was morning, and the laptop's battery had died. My heart raced as I realized I hadn't seen what had happened overnight. I rushed into the living room to check the painting. This time, the shadowy figure was no longer in the background. It was standing beside another family member in the portrait, an older man with a thick mustache and stern eyes. His expression, like the young woman's before him, had twisted into one of abject horror. His mouth was frozen mid-scream, and his eyes were black and oozing that same red liquid. I grabbed the camera, my hands shaking as I reviewed the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Then, sometime around 3 a.m., the figure began to shift. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, like watching time-lapse footage of a shadow creeping across the wall. It moved closer to the older man, its outline becoming sharper, more defined. By the time it was standing next to him, its form was almost humanoid. Tall and cloaked in darkness, its features still obscured. Then, without warning, the older man's face began to change. His expression morphed, his eyes blackened, and streaks of red appeared. I slammed the laptop shut, unable to watch anymore. I couldn't stay in the house another night, not after that. I packed a bag and drove to a motel in the nearest town, desperate for a reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. But even there, I couldn't escape it. That night, I dreamed of the portrait. The shadowy figure was there, standing in front of the frame, its head tilted as if it were looking at me. When I woke up, my phone was buzzing. I had a missed call from an unknown number and a voicemail. The message was static at first, but then I heard a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. I hung up and immediately checked my car keys, ready to leave the town altogether, but something stopped me. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was going on, it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I decided to return to the house the next morning, determined to get to the bottom of it. When I walked back into the house, the first thing I noticed was the silence. I forced myself into the living room, bracing for what I might see. The painting was the same, or at least it looked the same at first. The shadowy figure was now standing in the center of the group, surrounded by the remaining family members. Their expressions hadn't changed yet, but there was something off about their eyes. They weren't blackened like the others, but they seemed duller, lifeless. That was when I noticed something else. a faint red streak on the floor, leading from the fireplace to the hallway. I stared at the faint red streak on the floor for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced with every possible explanation, none of them comforting. I grabbed a paper towel from the kitchen and dabbed at the streak, confirming what I already knew. It was blood, fresh and sticky. My stomach churned as I followed the trail down the hallway. It led to the study, a room I had only glanced into during my initial tour of the house. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room packed with old books, stacks of paper, and a massive oak desk that dominated the space. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my presence, and the faint metallic tang of blood lingered. The streak stopped abruptly at the foot of the desk, pooling into a small, dark stain. I crouched down, trying to see if there was anything hidden underneath, but the floor was bare. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was here, just out of reach. I turned my attention to the desk itself, which was cluttered with faded documents, brittle with age. Among them were letters and ledgers, many written in the same formal, spidery handwriting I had seen before. I sifted through them carefully, trying to piece together the fragments of my family's past. Most of it seemed like typical record-keeping, expenses, deeds, and correspondence. But then I found a leather-bound journal tucked into one of the drawers. Its spine was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed and faintly musty. The journal belonged to someone named Theodore, though there was no last name. Based on the dates written inside, the entries spanned the late 1800s, far earlier than any records I'd found so far. I started reading, skimming through mundane accounts of daily life on the estate, harvests, weather patterns, minor repairs to the house. But then, about halfway through, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more frantic. July 3rd, 1892. The deal is done. I have no choice now. The cost is steep, but the rewards will be worth it. I must keep reminding myself of that. July 7th, 1892. The first is always the hardest. I can't bring myself to do it, but I know what will happen if I fail. I saw it last night staring at me from the portrait. It was waiting. I stopped reading, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse thundered in my ears as I flipped through the pages, scanning for more entries that might explain what Theodore meant. There were more references to a deal, to something watching him, and to the portrait. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized he could only be referring to the one hanging in the living room. At this point, I was too deep to stop. I tore through the journal, desperate for answers. The final entry was dated July 15th, 1892, and the handwriting was barely legible, scrawled in a frenzy. It's over. I can't go through with it. God help my family. I've damned us all. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. Theodore must have been one of my ancestors, but what had he done? What deal had he made, and what was the cost? My head was spinning with questions, but deep down, I felt I already knew the answers. I just didn't want to admit it yet. I spent the rest of the day combing through the study, searching for anything that could shed more light on Theodore's cryptic entries. I found another box of papers hidden in the back of the closet, filled with old photographs and documents. Most of the photos were formal portraits, stiff and colorless, but one in particular caught my eye. It was a smaller version of the family portrait hanging in the living room, though this one seemed to be much older. The shadowy figure was there, lurking in the background, though it was less distinct than in the version I had. I flipped the photo over and found a handwritten note on the back. "Do not let it out." My heart dropped. What did that mean? How could something trapped in a portrait possibly get out? I glanced nervously toward the living room, as though the figure could somehow sense my thoughts. Night fell faster than I expected, and before I knew it, the house was drenched in shadows. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom that night, so I set up camp in the study, hoping the piles of old documents might provide some sort of distraction. I left the door slightly ajar, listening for any noise, any hint that something was moving in the house. The hours dragged on. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. I tried to focus on the documents, but my eyes kept drifting toward the small version of the portrait I had found. It was propped up against the desk, the shadowy figure seeming to glare at me no matter where I sat. I thought about destroying it, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the sinking feeling that it would escape. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound coming from the living room. It was barely audible, like the rustling of fabric or the scrape of something heavy being moved. My chest tightened, and I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me. I crept toward the door, every step deliberate, my ears straining for any noise. When I reached the living room, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the walls. I pushed the door open slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The painting was exactly where it had always been, but the figure had moved again. It was standing in the center now, its form more defined than ever. I could make out the shape of its head, its long arms, and the faint impression of fingers. It seemed to be reaching toward the remaining family members in the portrait, its intent clear. And then I noticed something else. One of the faces had changed again. The older woman near the edge of the frame, who had previously been smiling faintly, now wore a look of terror. Her eyes were blackened, her mouth open in a silent scream, and streaks of red ran down her face. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my grip. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Instead, I sat in the study with the portrait and the journal, trying to make sense of it all. Theodore had made some kind of deal, and now his descendants, including me, were paying the price. But what kind of deal could bind a family for generations? And what did the figure in the portrait want? The next morning, I made up my mind to dig deeper. If there were answers in this house, I was going to find them, no matter how terrifying they might be. I spent the next day tearing through the house, desperate for answers. The journal, the photographs, the cryptic warnings, they all pointed to something sinister that my family had been tied to for generations. But I needed to know exactly what Theodore had done. What had he bargained for, and why was I now caught in the aftermath? The weight of the situation pressed heavily on me as I rummaged through every drawer, every box, and every hidden nook of the house. My search eventually led me to the basement, a place I had deliberately avoided since moving in. The air was damp and cold as I descended the creaky wooden steps, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, crates, and cobwebs that seemed untouched for decades. But in the far corner, I noticed something unusual. A wooden trunk, sealed with an ornate brass lock. It was different from the other items down here, well preserved and polished, as if someone had cared for it. I pried it open with a crowbar, and inside, I found a collection of papers, all meticulously organized. The documents were chilling to read. Theodore's handwriting was everywhere, recounting in detail the events that had led to this nightmare. He had made a deal with an entity, something ancient and nameless. The promise was wealth and power for his family, but the cost was unimaginable. Theodore had been required to take the life of a family member, an act that would bind the entity to the family and ensure their prosperity. The consequences of breaking the deal were dire. The entity would enter the family portrait it has made and enact its vengeance, killing each family member depicted, one by one, until no one was left. Theodore had faltered, unable to commit the horrific act, and the deal had been broken. As I read, I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The entity had been bound to the portrait ever since, its purpose clear: to hunt and kill each descendant until the family line was extinguished. I realized with dawning horror that the entity's vengeance didn't stop at the deaths. The grotesque transformations of the faces in the portrait, the blackened eyes, the terrified expressions, were its mark, a cruel display of its power. I ran back upstairs to the living room, my heart hammering in my chest. The portrait seemed to mock me, the shadowy figure now looming over the remaining family members. Only a handful of faces were left untouched, mine included. The older woman whose face had changed the night before was now gone entirely, leaving an empty space where she had been. I felt sick. I tried everything I could think of to rid myself of the cursed painting. First, I ripped it from the wall and smashed the frame to splinters. I tore the canvas into shreds with a kitchen knife, but no matter how much damage I inflicted, the portrait would reappear the next morning, pristine and back in its rightful place. I tried to leave it outside, bury it, even burn it, but it was no use. By dawn, it was always back on the wall, untouched. I reached out to local antique dealers, art restorers, even a historian at the nearest university, spinning a half-truth about the painting's origins. No one could explain it, let alone help me destroy it. When I tried to sell it, the buyers either backed out at the last minute or mysteriously disappeared. The portrait wouldn't let itself go. It was as if the house itself was working to keep it here, to keep me here. The nights grew worse. Every evening, the figure in the painting would shift, its form becoming clearer, more human. The remaining faces in the portrait grew more distorted, their expressions of fear more grotesque. I heard faint sounds throughout the house, soft whispers, the dragging of something heavy, and once, what I swore was the sound of someone breathing just behind me. The walls seemed to close in, the house alive with a malevolent presence. One night, as I sat in the study, poring over Theodore's journal for the 100th time, I heard a noise that froze me in place. It was the sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, coming from the living room. My breath caught as I reached for the flashlight, forcing myself to move. I crept toward the source of the noise, my pulse pounding in my ears. The living room was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. The portrait hung on the wall, but something was different. The figure was no longer confined to the background. It stood at the forefront now, fully formed, its face a twisted amalgamation of shadows and malice. Its long fingers seemed to reach toward the edges of the frame, as if trying to pull itself free. And then I saw it, my own face in the painting. I was there, standing among the other family members, my expression eerily neutral. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. I was next. The final days were a blur of terror and desperation. I barely slept, unable to escape the suffocating presence of the portrait. I tried barricading the room, covering the painting, even leaving the house altogether. But no matter what I did, the figure always moved. It was always there, waiting. I sat alone in the study. I knew my time was close. I clutched the journal in one hand and a heavy iron poker in the other, though I knew it was futile. Midnight came and went, and for a moment, I thought I might have been spared. But then the temperature dropped and the lights flickered. I heard it before I saw it. A high-pitched screech, followed by the sound of something dragging itself across the floor. The figure was no longer confined to the portrait. It was here in the house with me. I ran, my flashlight flickering wildly as I stumbled through the dark. I made it to the living room where the portrait still hung on the wall. It was empty. The faces of my ancestors were gone, every single one of them. The painting was nothing but an empty canvas now, save for the faint outline of the figure. I turned around, and there it was, standing in the doorway, its form impossibly tall and grotesque, its face a swirling void of darkness. The story ends here for now, but I leave this final note for anyone who finds it. The portrait is no longer in the house, and I don't know where it is. If you ever see it, run, never come close to the painting or this house. But if it comes back, God help you.